Boards bring, hopefully, an outside view and somewhat less of a direct involvement and interest in where the ideas come from and who the players will be that execute the ideas. And sometimes the management teams of nonprofit organizations get pretty wed to the ideas and excited about the possibilities, and it's an important reality check to have the boards of directors step back from that and say, okay, will this help us do better on our mission, or will it detract us from that? So sometimes having that distance is a useful thing. I think the role that boards play is to try to help figure out in what situations it's additive to the organization and in what situations it actually detracts them from to where they're successful today. In order to do that, boards have to have a clear picture of what value and what the mission actually is for that organization now. If they have a clear picture of those things, it becomes much easier to decide whether a new idea or a new possibility is complementary or whether it's actually detracting. And if it's detracting, we call it drift, and if it's complementary, we call it innovative and valuable. But what's interesting is without the framework of what value is being created, it's largely subjective as to whether it's drift or not. And boards have to do their homework in advance in order to actually make informed decisions about that. Otherwise, it's mostly just shooting from the hip and guessing.
One of the interesting aspects of not-for-profit organizations is the fact that really the chief executive of the organization and the board itself might have very different views in terms of what their role should be. Chief executives, executive directors of not-for-profits quite often traditionally have seen boards as fundraising mechanisms, ways to get resources in the organization, but really would prefer that most of the executive decisions, the strategic decisions, and operational decisions are left with the executive. A great way that boards can add value to these not-for-profit organizations is to really understanding their role in a different and more proactive way with regard to providing strategic insights in terms of where the organization might go, in terms of understanding and helping the organization itself to understand how do we measure performance here, how do we think about performance, how do we think about success. How do we define success as an organization? And those questions are much more difficult to answer in a not-for-profit setting, typically, than in a for-profit setting where you can look at financial outcomes and say this company is doing well or not as well. It's really incumbent upon boards to proactively determine what are the measures or the metrics that are useful to us as a board with regard to how well is this organization doing. Quite often, not-for-profits, like lots of other organizations, tend to do a large data dump of lots of financial information to their boards, and the board really can't sort through what's important and what's not. So if the board can bring some rigor around understanding, determining what the specific metrics would be, that could actually add a lot of value to the organization itself.
Organizational performance and board performance are somewhat distinct. You don't have to start with the notion that just because our organization is doing well, therefore the board is automatically doing well. You can directly measure what the board's doing. You can look at how well the board meetings function, how clearly the roles are defined, and actually ask the question and entertain the possibility that you may have a bad board overseeing a good organization or a good board overseeing a bad organization. They're not one and the same thing.
I think boards in many organizations that are for-profit oriented are really less likely to add much value to what the organization does. They're seen much more as a sort of oversight, a compliance mechanism that's really monitoring what the organization's doing, whereas a great board and a not-for-profit can make a huge tangible difference in what that not-for-profit can do in its organization and in the future. I think boards have a huge opportunity to bring a lot to these organizations on a few different dimensions. They can obviously provide strategic insights, strategic ideas about where the organization should go, what their strategy should be. They can also provide sort of the fundraising opportunities and opportunities for where the board might, where the organization might want to be looking for opportunities in terms of fundraising. I think the value the board brings is they can actually focus on what the organization is doing, both in terms of performance, which for many organizations, for many not-for-profits, the question about are we performing well, are we doing not so well, how do we monitor that, how do we measure that, is less well defined, more subjective, a little bit more ambiguous, arguably. And because of that, what organizations do is really create goals that in some cases are not as specific, not as clear-cut. I think what boards can do is help with the performance monitoring, management of the organization in terms of a not-for-profit. They can also certainly help and add lots of value in terms of the strategy, if they understand the way the strategy should be structured, because I think most not-for-profits in real time don't have a good sense necessarily of where we need to go in the future, and so they can bring that external point of view. And I think the last thing that boards can really do well in a not-for-profit, even better than in a for-profit setting, is provide access to resources, whether it's through networks, whether it's through social contacts, whether it's through donations. They can be real ambassadors to the organization, and that's a critically important part of what those kinds of organizations need. I think one of the key value adds potentially of a board is to really help the organization understand how it wants to measure performance. It's very easy in a not-for-profit setting, in an arts setting, to say we're doing a good job, we're successful, because it's a bit ambiguous and sometimes it's a bit squishy in terms of how do we measure success. People are coming in the door here, we must be doing well. In a for-profit organization setting, you'd be looking at more the bottom line, and I think there are other ways that boards can actually bring some of that rigor to not-for-profits. I think there are more degrees of freedom for a not-for-profit to define success in various ways, and it might help for the board to come in some cases, to really help the executive and to help the organization say, what are the ways we really want to understand success? What are the key 3 to 5 specific metrics or measures we would consider important in terms of how well this organization is doing? Not-for-profits tend sometimes to shy away from being really specific about goals and outcomes and objectives, and boards can help in formulating those decisions.
There's expertise in this field around how boards and managers can work well together that hasn't yet reached into the arts organizations fully, that oftentimes comes out of the for-profit world. And as a professor in a business school, I find the opportunity to teach those topics to new audiences, satisfying. I think it's actually useful. I think that the sincerity that arts organizations have around their mission, that it's genuinely motivating them. The idea, for example, that sharing this art form with this audience makes the world a better place is so motivating that I think that they derive a lot of value from that. In the for-profit world, I think some organizations get so far removed from that level of value in their mission, and it turns just into a business, that as a result, while they may be aligned around making money or otherwise creating other value, I don't know that it has the same sense of unifying force and alignment that the nonprofit arts organizations get out of their mission.
I think there's lots of opportunity for educating people that maybe haven't been exposed to some of these ideas, some of these topics. In the for-profit world, especially with medium to larger companies, even smaller companies, frankly, people have been exposed to governance issues to some extent, and they sort of know how models work. I found in the not-for-profit world, often you can provide interesting new approaches, interesting new insights that they haven't seen. And I think tying into the importance of the board,